Hello guys, Ancient Gameplays, I'm Fabio Pisco, and welcome to my channel. As for today's video we have a GPU comparison, but wait. Firstly, I'm kind of revamping Firstly, I'm kind of revamping the benchmarks, changing their order in order for the bigger numbers to be in the top instead of being in the bottom for each GPU, which makes more sense for me, of course. I believe it makes more sense for you as well. And secondly, I'm adding productivity benchmarks for the GPU. This time I'm adding Cinebench R24 with a graphics benchmark. I'm adding AI benchmarks as well, so stable diffusion, machine learning and so on. And I'm also adding Blender and, well, a few others like Premiere 2024 and so on. And on top of that, I'm also adding Hellblade to the gaming benchmarks and the usual ray tracing ones and so on, so on. So productivity and gaming benchmarks now for the GPUs as well. And we start this with the RX 7600 XT versus the RTX 4060, and in the name of science I actually put in the middle the RX 7600 non-XT as well, because I believe that the results do have their value. So it's kind of 7600 versus 7600 XT versus 4060. And since we talked about value, don't forget today's sponsor. Today's video sponsor is GVG Mall, bringing you lots of software deals like Windows 10, Windows 11, Office 2019 or 2021 with a new Windows 11 design. And for all of these you can use my SKG discount code for 30% off, getting a Windows 11 serial key for $22 and a Windows 10 one for only $15. Then use the key on your Windows settings and you'll have an activated system. Now guys, just before going to the benchmarks, let's talk about pricing. As for the American prices, I got them from PC Part Picker, and as for the 7600 non-XT, we got the cheapest one for $250, which is not bad at all. Then the 7600 XT for $319. You have to pay $60 more for 8GB more of VRAM and a bit higher power limits, which makes no sense to me. And then we have the 4060 for $299, so $40 over the 7600 and $20 below the 7600 XT. As for the European prices, we have the 7600 non-XT at €275, the 7600 XT at €339, which once again is a big difference for only 8GB VRAM more and a bit higher power limits. And then we have the 4060 for €309, basically €30 below the 7600 XT. And with this all said, which card should you pick? Should you go for the cheaper one, the 7600? Should you go for the 4060 that has the NVIDIA DLSS frame generation more incorporated, has DLSS ray reconstruction, usually better in productivity? Or should you go for the 7600 XT with higher power limits, so in theory more performance, and double the VRAM, in this case 16GB? Let's find out. This time we start with productivity benchmarks, and we start with Cinebench R24 that now includes a GPU benchmark, using CUDA for the NVIDIA GPUs and HIP for the AMD ones. And here we can see the massive difference between the RTX 4060 and the AMD cards, with the RX 7600 XT being 10% faster than the RX 7600, but also 84% slower than the RTX 4060, 84 while consuming way more power. A massive win for NVIDIA here. Gladly, things are a bit different when we're talking about Premiere 2024, with the RX 7600 XT and non-XT performing virtually the same, and the RTX 4060 being 16% faster than both the AMD cards, which is even more relevant if we consider that even the 7600 non-XT consumes around 60 watts more than the 4060. And now we move into AI benchmarks, starting with Procyon image creation benchmark. And by the way, I want to thank UL Benchmarks for sending me a serial key for their software. Helps a lot. As for the results, the AMD cards use the ONNX, while the NVIDIA one is using CUDA, so with another AI inference engine, maybe the AMD cards could have performed better, but I honestly don't know as I'm no expert here. Still, the 4060 is 67% faster than the 7600 XT and 76% faster than the 7600, which is of course a massacre for the AMD cards. The AI vision benchmark is a different scenario though, as we're now talking about several machine learning applications using Windows ML for AMD cards and Tensor RT for the NVIDIA one. And it seems that even though the AMD cards are still slower, the difference is much smaller now, with the 4060 being 32% faster than the 7600 XT and 43% faster than the 7600, which is still a lot, but, well, less than before. And to finalize the productivity benchmarks, we have Blender with open data. And I must tell you that this benchmark is not using the AMD HIP/Rock'em, hence why the AMD cards are performing so poorly. They would still be slower, way slower than the NVIDIA one of course, but not like this where they're like 3 times slower. From what I searched online, the AMD cards should be delivering from 1.5 to 2 times the numbers you see here, which is not that bad. Once again, still slower than the NVIDIA cards here, but not this bad. But well, let's see the gaming benchmarks now. Starting with Plague Tale Requiem, we have an interesting scenario with the RTX 4060 performing the same as the RX 7600 XT, even though it consumes 100 watts less power, which is a lot, and is generally a bit cheaper, with the non-XT 7600 performing decently well, delivering around 93% the performance of the other cards, while being quite cheaper. At 1440p the results are more or less the same, with the 7600 almost catching the other two cards, but with all of them being below the 60 average FPS mark. Assassin's Creed Mirage it is, and in this case the RTX 4060 is still the fastest card, being around 8% faster than the AMD counterparts while once again consuming less power. Something that only worsens at 1440p, where it is now 9% faster on average and 19% faster in the 1% lows, delivering a smoother gameplay than the AMD cards here. And it is only when we move to Cyberpunk 2077 that we finally see the RX 7600 XT overpowering the RTX 4060. In this case by 4%, which is something that wouldn't be actually noticeable in real gameplay. Although the RX 7600 already does a very decent job and it costs quite less than both the other cards, so not bad at all. At 1440p though, the RX 7600 XT takes the lead, now by 10%, possibly due to having 16GB VRAM, while the 7600 non-XT manages to get on par with the 4060 for $40 less. And the first game where we can actually see the AMD cards performing considerably better is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, where the AMD cards are known to strive, especially the RDNA 3 ones. At 1080p, the RX 7600 XT is 10% faster than the non-XT and 29% faster than the RTX 4060. At 1440p the scales get maintained, and even the cheaper 7600 gets to be 14% faster than the RTX 4060. Definitely a game that loves AMD's new architecture. Forza Horizon 5 is an interesting scenario as well, because the RX 7600 and 7600 XT are exactly the same card apart from VRAM capacity, but since Smart Access Memory is a thing, with it enabled, the RX 7600 XT has a bigger boost in this game due to also having more VRAM, being 13% faster than the 7600 non-XT and 6% faster than the RTX 4060. At 1440p it is more or less the same, with the RX 7600 XT being the fastest card and having a much larger performing boost with SAM compared to its 8GB non-XT version. In Hogwarts Legacy, that uses Unreal Engine 4, the RX 7600 non-XT outmatches the RTX 4060 by 8%, with the 7600 XT being slightly faster, which is quite awesome actually, and at 1440p the RTX 4060 loses even more ground and keeps losing performance with rebar enabled, which makes no sense at all, with the 7600 XT still delivering considerably higher 1% lows than its non-XT version, as it features 16GB VRAM. Microsoft Flight Simulator is a very steady benchmark, with the RX 7600 XT still losing to the RTX 4060, being also 8% faster than the RX 7600 and consuming less power, but it is also more expensive of course. As for 1440p, well, the 7600 XT now matches the 4060, with the 7600 non-XT still being able to deliver over 60 average FPS here, which once again is not bad at all, as it also costs less. Alan Wake 2 is a game that features lots of NVIDIA features, like DLSS frame generation and ray reconstruction, and considering Control never even got FSR 1.0, I don't think Alan Wake will ever feature FSR 3.1 frame generation. But even though that happens, both AMD cards deliver very good results here, with even the RX 7600 non-XT delivering the same results as the RTX 4060 with only slightly lower 1% lows. Something that doesn't really change much at 1440p, where all cards perform decently well for their tier, to be honest. And as for the mixed rasterization and ray tracing benchmark, we have Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, which is one title that will run with software ray tracing, but will take advantage of the hardware dedicated cores in case they're available. And that's why we see the RTX 4060 being 14% faster than both AMD cards, while consuming at least 60 watts less. As we go to 1440p, the difference gets maintained overall, with the 4060 oddly losing performance, a lot of performance actually, with resizable bar enabled, but taking that result aside, nothing really changed. So if you want to play Avatar, the 4060 is recommended. And now we have Starfield. If you look closely, you can immediately see one difference in between the RX 7600 and 7600 XT. Which is the FPS boost from Smart Access Memory that is not present with the 7600 non-XT. I believe that happens since that card only has 8GB VRAM and Smart Access Memory can't really work properly there, so with the 7600 XT's 16GB, SAM can do its job properly, now increasing the performance by 18%, making it slightly faster than the RTX 4060. And oddly, the same thing applies at 1440p, and I even retested the 7600 to see if the driver or game updates changed results, but not really. It is what it is, I guess, with the RX 7600 XT being the fastest card here. And The Last of Us presents exactly the same scenario as Starfield, with Smart Access Memory delivering a massive 21% performance uplift, making the RX 7600 XT 4% faster than the RTX 4060, while the RX 7600 non-XT is left in the dust with no FPS boost whatsoever. And it is exactly the same at 1440p, where the 7600 XT delivers basically 60 average FPS, while the 7600 barely goes above 52, and the RTX 4060 loses performance with rebar enabled. Again. Getting closer to the final line, we have Robocop Rock City, an Unreal Engine 5 title. At 1080p using TSR quality, we have the RTX 4060 once again matching the RX 7600 XT with half the VRAM and 100 watts less of power draw. At 1440p we have basically the same results, with the RX 7600 non-XT almost reaching the 60 average FPS and costing quite less than the other two cards. So once again, not that bad I guess. And to finalize the rasterization benchmarks, we have a new addition, Hellblade 2. This is more or less the same scenario as Robocop before, but now with the RX 7600 non-XT also matching the other two cards, which gives it better value in this game. As soon as we move to 1440p, even with TSR at 75%, well, won't really do much, and sadly this is another game where the DLSS is much better implemented than FSR, and the 4060 is able to use better looking upscaling and frame generation, while the AMD cards need to resort to mods, for example, so even though the 7600 XT is slightly faster, the RTX 4060 is just a much better value here. As for the 13 games average, things are within the expected, with the RX 7600 XT being overall the fastest card at both resolutions, but with the RTX 4060 being really close while delivering better features like the DLSS that as of now delivers better quality than FSR and a way lower power draw compared to both AMD cards here. And considering it also performs better in productivity and is overall cheaper than the 7600 XT, it is kind of a no-brainer. Let's now watch the ray tracing benchmarks.
But lost hope. We're not from here either. Stellantis locked us up here a year ago.
The first ray tracing benchmark is with Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition, and even though this game is not recent of course, it is a full ray tracing game, meaning that you can't even run it unless you have a ray tracing capable GPU. And as expected, the RTX 4060 just demolishes the other two cards, being 27% faster than the 7600 XT at 1080p, 32% faster at 1440p, and 20% faster at 4K, which is a lot. It is worth noting though that the AMD GPUs tend to deliver better 1% lows in this game, as seen here at 1080p. And even though Cyberpunk 2077 works well with the RDNA 3 GPUs, as soon as we move to ray tracing, the NVIDIA cards are just unmatched. The RTX 4060 is 47% faster than the RX 7600 XT with ray tracing enabled, having the same 1% lows the 7600 has on average, which is borderline mocking, while also being the only card able to push over 60 FPS with the DLSS enabled. At 1440p the difference gets down to 30%, as the 8GB VRAM are a restriction for the RTX 4060, while the 7600 non-XT is performing like crap here, delivering only 7 FPS. But if we reduce the render resolution with the DLSS and FSR upscaling, the RTX 4060 gets to be once again 43% faster than the RX 7600 XT, while consuming less power and costing less. In Resident Evil 4, apart from the RX 7600 XT that has 16GB VRAM, the other cards needed to have the texture quality set to high 1GB, which doesn't look that great. This in order to run ray tracing, otherwise the game would give an error and quit, due to the lack of VRAM. As we move to 1440p things get more VRAM intensive, and now the RX 7600 XT is not only faster in rasterization, as it now matches the RTX 4060 in ray tracing. Results that get more or less maintained at 1440p ultrawide as well, where the RX 7600 non-XT is now much slower than the XT version with ray tracing enabled, once again due to the lack of VRAM. Spider-Man Remastered is another game that loves RAM and VRAM, especially for ray tracing and especially if your GPU has lower buzz width. At 1080p, the RTX 4060 is 11% faster in rasterization and 18% faster in ray tracing. But as soon as you look at the 1% lows for both 8GB VRAM GPUs, they're way lower than they should be. And that happens because they only have 8GB VRAM, and the game requires quite more to perform smooth. And we see that even more as we go to 1440p, where things get even worse for the RTX 4060 that is now slower than the RX 7600 XT, that also delivers a much smoother gameplay with 46.2 FPS in the 1% lows compared to the 19.9 FPS stutterfest with the RTX 4060. And Ratchet and Clank proves my point, again. 8GB are just not enough for recent games, especially if they use direct storage like this one. Where even in rasterization, I'm even stuttering, the RX 7600 XT is 24% faster than the RTX 4060, and keep in mind that these two are basically the same card, but the VRAM difference is just absurd here. And that 1440p thing's turned into a nightmare for the RX 7600 non-XT that barely touches the 35 FPS mark, with the 1% lows dropping to 14 FPS, which is just insanely bad, while the 7600 XT sits comfortably at 68 FPS with 47 FPS in the 1% lows, being faster than the RTX 4060 in rasterization and ray tracing. And now that you've seen all the results in all situations, let's move to the conclusion. And well guys, here we are now, and yeah. Honestly, after the benchmarks that you saw, I believe there's, in this moment, right now, as of now, there is no reason to buy the 7600 XT over the 4060. Unless you're keeping that card for, let's say, 4 or 5 years, which I believe doesn't really make much sense because you're holding off to a low tier card, so you're better just, well, keep it for 2-3 years at maximum, or if you're doing for more, I mean, I don't really know, but if you're keeping that card for a long time, maybe the 16GB VRAM will come handy, as you saw, for example, in Ratchet and Clank, in other games like Spider-Man, but at the same time, any game besides Ratchet and Clank was working completely fine without using ray tracing. And if you're using an entry-level GPU, you'll most likely not be using ray tracing, which makes sense once again. So unless you're going in those really specific scenarios, I believe there's no reason to get the 7600 XT over the 4060. And my reasons are basically that the 4060 is better in productivity, and even if you don't care about productivity and you're just gaming, as of now you have a better upscaler with DLSS, you also have better ray tracing performance, not that it matters a lot, and you also have frame generation implemented in more games, and even things like ray reconstruction in games like Alan Wake, Cyberpunk and so on, and if it comes out in more games, you will also be able to use it in more games. And for example, in Alan Wake 2, it does make the difference in terms of performance. You can run ray tracing with the 4060, I tested it, 4060 if you use the DLSS and frame generation and ray reconstruction. Without ray reconstruction, well, you can't do it. And there's a thing the 7600 can't, and even the 7600 XT, sorry, can't. They can run it, but the performance will be just really bad, while the 4060 can actually deliver a decent experience there. So there's a plus. You have better technologies as of now, of course, and you have way lower power draw. And when I say way lower, I mean way lower. We're talking about overclock versus overclock, as you saw there on the video. We're talking about 120 watts on the 4060 to a maximum of 230 watts on the 7600 XT Sapphire Pulse. So 120 or 130 tops versus 230. We're talking about 100 watts difference, which is a lot. It's a lot. If we're talking about 40, 50, maybe if the other card is more powerful, well, it doesn't really make much of a problem. But if we're talking about 100 watts at basically the same performance, more ray tracing performance and more productivity performance, and on top of that, it even costs $20 less. Unless you absolutely need those 16GB VRAM, the 4060 as of now is a no-brainer. Or of course, if you want to go a bit cheaper and maybe get a better CPU, one more NVMe disk or something like that, or more RAM, for example, in that case just get the 7600 non-XT that gets, well, let's say like 92% of the 4060's performance. And at the same time you get, well, like a $40 discount. Yeah, it all comes up to what you want, but in my opinion, as of now, the 4060 is the way to go for the reasons that I presented before. And well guys, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe and share this video, and don't forget to leave your comment in the comment section. Let me know what you think about the performance of these GPUs. Which one would you pick in your case scenario, or will you pick if you're going to buy one of these three, and let me know why. You know that I prefer, for example, the AMD software. Generally, I prefer the AMD software. But in this scenario, in this specific scenario of 7600 XT versus 4060, even with 8 gigabytes VRAM more. I mean, I can't really justify it unless you're keeping the GPU for, let's say, 4 or 5 years, because any other scenario than that, or a very specific scenario where you need that VRAM, it makes no sense to get the 7600 XT over the 4060. It just doesn't make. So yeah, once again, thanks a lot for watching, and see you in the next video, guys.